Imagine waking up in a bedroom so enormous it could swallow an entire immigrant tenement, and somehow still feeling absolutely miserable. That was the daily reality of New York's filthy rich in the early 1900s. People wrapped in silk, drowning in privilege, and yet constantly exhausted by anxiety, boredom, and the pressure to impress other wealthy people they didn't even like. This was a world where some families spent more money on fresh flowers each week than their servants earned in an entire year. And yes, they complained about the flowers too. And listen, before we sink into this glittering mess together, a gentle reminder: thousands of you fall asleep to these stories every single night and somehow still haven't subscribed. You know who you are. Don't be one of the freeloaders the Gilded Age elite would have judged. Now, one question before we time travel. What time is it where you are right now? Tell me in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy little community reaches. So now, settle in. Let the lights dim. We're drifting back to a quieter, gas-lit Manhattan, where unimaginable wealth glittered just above a city of shadows. If you and I were to take a quiet nighttime stroll through New York City in the early 1900s, we would start not in the noisy, crowded streets below, but high up on Fifth Avenue, the fabled Millionaire's Row, where the air smelled faintly of polished mahogany, imported gardenias, and the kind of confidence only old money can produce. While most of Manhattan slept under flickering lamps and sooty factory smoke, this strip of Fifth Avenue shimmered like a necklace laid across the city's throat. The mansions didn't just sit there, they performed. Some glowed from within like warm embers. Others looked like miniature European palaces, dropped accidentally onto American soil. Huge limestone facades with carved angels, marble balconies, and windows so tall they could double as doorways. Wealthy families didn't do normal houses. They collected architectural styles like they collected diamonds. Renaissance here, Baroque there, a dash of French chateau to really show neighbors who was in charge. On the street, rows of carriages waited patiently. Each had its own pair of glossy, perfectly groomed horses, their hooves echoing softly on the stone. Liveried footmen stood beside them, in crisp uniforms, so spotless it looked like they had been ironed into existence. Their job was to look decorative, and to freeze elegantly in the cold while their employers attended whatever extravagant event was happening inside those glowing mansions. And those marble steps? Oh, the steps were a whole performance of their own, polished daily, sometimes twice a day, until they gleamed under the gas lamps. You couldn't just walk up those steps. You ascended them the way a king steps onto a throne, and once at the top, you were greeted not by a simple front door, but by imported Italian stone statues, elaborate wrought iron gates, or carved wooden doors so heavy they needed servants on both sides to open them. Now, as we walk closer, imagine the faint shimmer of gaslit fountains along the sidewalks, the gentle trickle of water catching the light just enough to remind passers-by that the people who lived here were not merely rich, they were filthy rich in the most theatrical sense. Some families installed elaborate fountains purely because Europe had them, and wealthy Americans of the time had a terrible habit of collecting European ideas the way children collect shiny objects. But let's step inside one of these mansions, because the real obscene wealth wasn't on the outside, it was layered within. The moment we passed through the doorway, we would be swallowed by warm, golden light. Ballrooms stretched out like glittering caverns, their polished floors reflecting thousands of tiny electric bulbs. Yes, electric light, a rare privilege at the time. While much of the city still relied on gas and kerosene, these homes flaunted their electricity as visibly as possible. Chandeliers hung overhead, but not the dainty ones we imagine today. These were monstrous, shimmering constructions the size of early automobiles, dripping with crystals that sparkled like frozen rain. Every wall had something expensive happening to it. Murals depicting mythical scenes, velvet tapestries, imported from overseas, woodwork so intricate you could stare at a single panel for 10 minutes and still notice new details. Every corner of these rooms whispered, "We are richer than you will ever be." And also, please notice how much we spent on this molding alone. But none of this grandeur, none of the chandeliers, velvet walls, marble columns, or swirling murals could exist without the hidden world beneath our feet. And that is where we go next. Imagine descending a staircase behind a disguised panel, or entering a hallway so narrow only a servant could comfortably pass. Beneath those luxurious floors stretched a maze of service passages, cramped, dim, and silent. They were built to ensure the wealthy never had to witness the labor that powered their fantasy. Down here, an army moved with precision. Cooks preparing midnight meals, laundresses ironing mountains of linen, maids polishing stair rails until they gleamed, and footmen quietly delivering notes or setting fires in rooms moments before their employers entered. Everything was timed, everything was choreographed. If a wealthy family member decided they wanted warm milk at 3 a.m, a servant was already halfway to the pantry. You would hear barely a whisper, maybe the soft clink of dishes, or the muffled rush of steam from the laundry rooms. Servants were trained to appear, act, and disappear like ghosts. Many of them were immigrants, working 16-hour days for wages the family upstairs spent on fresh roses for a single dinner table. While the wealthy entertained upstairs, smiling beneath chandeliers the size of small planets, the people downstairs were living a very different life. Their world smelled of starch, smoke, and sweat, a stark contrast to the perfume and champagne drifting above. And yet, the most fascinating part of this hidden world wasn't the labor itself, but the psychology behind it. Because behind every shimmering detail upstairs, the velvet walls, the imported statues, the glittering ballrooms lay anxiety, a deep and constant pressure to maintain status, to never slip, to be seen at the right events, to host the most extravagant dinners, to appear wealthier than one already was. Imagine living in a mansion with 50 rooms, but still panicking over whether your new ballroom curtains look too similar to the Vanderbilts, or wearing a diamond necklace worth more than a city block, but worrying someone's emerald tiara would outsparkle you. That was the reality of Fifth Avenue, a gorgeous, glittering arena where every detail was a competition, every event was a test, and every neighbor was quietly watching. And as we go further, imagine stepping once more into the cool night air. Behind us, the mansions glow like embers. Ahead, the dark streets of New York stretch into a restless city, and between those two worlds, the glittering elite above and the struggling masses below, lies a city both beautiful and brutal, gilded and grim. A city where wealth didn't just shine, it burned. If you thought New York's mansions looked absurd from the outside, wait until you see what the people inside did for entertainment, because for the filthy rich of early 1900s New York, a party wasn't just a party. It was a declaration of dominance, a flex so dramatic, so unnecessary, so wildly unhinged that modern billionaires would look at the receipts and say, "You." Let's start with the warm-up act, the champagne bathtub. Yes, an actual bathtub, filled with champagne, not for drinking for guests to admire. A woman named Hope Hampton was rumored to have one installed, so guests could gather around it like it was some sort of sacred fountain of youth. Imagine casually pouring the modern equivalent of $15,000 of champagne into plumbing. Imagine the plumber's face. Imagine the sticky disaster if anyone so much as bumped the faucet. And then there were the live lions, because why wouldn't you hire a pair of live lions for ambience? One famously extravagant hostess, Marguerite Missy Maloney, threw a circus-themed party where large cats were actually brought into her ballroom. Nothing says prestige like risking being eaten next to the hors d'oeuvres. The guests, dressed in embroidered gowns and tuxedos, sipped champagne while pretending not to notice the giant predator, making eye contact with them from across the parquet floor. Perfectly normal, perfectly civilized, perfectly deranged. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a culture where throwing a party meant spending the equivalent of $5 to $30 million today on a single night. If you're imagining big balloons and some fancy candles, stop. These people imported entire atmospheres. They built Egyptian tombs, Roman forums, medieval banquet halls, enchanted forests, and life-size replicas of European train stations, all inside their Manhattan homes. There were parties where snow fell from the ceiling, parties where attendees arrived dressed as Greek gods, parties where the food alone cost more than most people's homes. And the best part? These weren't even the strangest features. Some hosts went so far as to employ teams of artists just to design the invitation cards, which were so ornate you could frame them. Others commissioned operas to be performed in their living rooms. There were champagne waterfalls, floral displays that required entire greenhouses to produce, and ice sculptures taller than most of Manhattan's police officers. But beneath the glittering surface of all this magnificence lies something far more interesting, the true reason these parties existed. Because here's the secret. None of this was really about fun. Not at all. These parties were war-bloodless, champagne-sticky war fought with gowns, orchestras, and imported seafood. Every wealthy family in New York was locked in a constant battle to outshine their rivals. Invitations were weapons. Seating arrangements were political statements. Who arrived late? Who arrived too early? Who was allowed near the host? Every decision was calculated. A perfectly executed party could elevate a family's social rank for a season. A demonstration of wealth, taste, connections, and, most importantly, power. Picture this. You're attending a ball hosted by an old money family who claims your new money fortune is vulgar. You are determined to prove them wrong. You arrive in diamonds the size of walnuts. You sweep into the ballroom as the orchestra swells because, yes, the host has paid the conductor extra to cue the music when you walk in. Your gown glows under electric light, while your rival's looks mysteriously dim. Your lighting was planned weeks in advance. At parties like these, even the menu was a battlefield. If you served oysters, your neighbor served oysters with truffles. If you offered imported wine, your rival served imported wine cooled with ice, carved from the Arctic. This was a world where wealth was displayed not quietly, not gracefully, but aggressively, like a peacock who's just found out someone else brought a bigger feather. But here's where things get truly fascinating, because behind every spectacular party, behind the fountains of champagne and the orchestras and the lions, there was something deeply fragile, a quiet, trembling undercurrent, the emotional underbelly. Because while the parties looked like paradise, the people attending them were often teetering on the edge of burnout, panic, or quiet despair. People drank themselves numb, not just because champagne was unlimited, but because the pressure to maintain perfection was exhausting. Some showed up to these events after spending hours arguing with spouses or crying behind locked dressing room doors. Some came purely to prevent rumors from starting about why they weren't there. Affairs were common, not out of passion but out of emotional starvation, boredom, or spite. Guests flirted recklessly while pretending not to notice their spouses doing the same across the room. The gossip that swirled through these parties was enough to power several newspapers, which, coincidentally, it often did. And beneath all this glitter lay a silent fear, the fear of social failure, the fear that your wealth wasn't enough, that your rivals were laughing at you behind their fans, that next year your party might be too small, too dull, too cheap-looking, because in this world, appearances weren't everything, they were the only thing. And so, after the guests drifted home, after the music faded, after the lions were escorted out and the champagne bathtub drained, the hosts often sat alone in their cavernous rooms, too tired to speak, too overstimulated to sleep, too anxious about what the newspapers would say in the morning. That was the truth behind these jaw-dropping spectacles. They weren't celebrations. They were survival tactics, a glittering, shimmering shield that hid the trembling hands behind it. If you thought the parties were chaotic, wait until you see what happened when the lights dimmed and the gossip began to simmer. Because in early 1900s New York, the wealthy didn't just fear bankruptcy, they feared something far worse. Losing money was a tragedy. Losing your reputation was an extinction-level event. It was the kind of disaster that could get you quietly removed from guest lists, erased from club registries, and politely deleted from every social circle that mattered. And all it took to begin this slow, devastating downfall was a whisper. Let's start with a classic location for the birth of a rumor. Picture a glittering, velvet-lined balcony. Society's elite sitting in rows, pretending to focus on the soprano belting her heart out on stage. Meanwhile, the real performance was happening in the seats. A lady, wrapped in enough diamonds to blind the entire mezzanine, would lean slightly toward her companion and whisper something small, a rumor about a rival's husband, a scandal brewing in someone's townhouse, or a mysterious absence from last weekend's ball. And just like that, the rumor was released into the wild. It didn't matter if the scandal was true. Half the fun was in the speculation. A single whisper at the opera could travel from balcony to ballroom to breakfast rooms across Manhattan within hours. By morning, someone you liked or hated might find themselves starring in a story they absolutely did not audition for. Sometimes, scandal arrived more dramatically, wrapped in a mysterious letter. No one in high society opened mail casually. Letters were weapons, especially the anonymous kind. You might receive an envelope containing a vague warning. You should ask where your husband really was last evening. Or something more explicit, a photo no one should ever have taken. A scrap of overheard dialogue, a confession someone accidentally wrote down. Even the newspapers got involved. Society columnists were the influencers of their day, passive-aggressive powerhouses who could elevate or eviscerate with a single sentence. They wrote in flowery, coded language. Mrs. X was regrettably absent from the Fitzgerald Gala last night. Translation: someone is hiding something. Or, Mr. Y appeared unusually fatigued at today's luncheon. Translation: someone drank too much, cheated, or both. But rumors were only the first ripple. When the water got choppy, the rich called in the professionals. Enter private investigators. These weren't trenchcoat-wearing detectives from noir films. These investigators were polished, discreet, and terrifyingly effective. Wealthy families hired them to follow rivals, friends, spouses, sometimes even their own children. Their job was simple: collect information. Investigators lurked outside hotels, watched entrances to speakeasies, followed suspicious carriages through the fog. They bribed servants, intercepted letters, and developed photographs in dark rooms hidden inside tenement buildings. It was a thriving business funded entirely by people who didn't trust each other. And the evidence they collected, that went straight into safes, enormous steel safes hidden behind paintings, inside master bedrooms, or in locked rooms only the butler could access. Some families had entire drawers labeled financial risk, marital evidence, hostile alliances, and my personal favorite, do not open unless absolutely necessary. Inside were letters written in desperation, diaries filled with incriminating entries, photographs of individuals who absolutely should not have been in the same room together, bank receipts, coded messages, and notes about who was seeing whom and why. But while the wealthy loved possessing secrets, they lived in absolute terror of being the subject of someone else's. Because once a rumor took hold and evidence floated around Manhattan like perfume smoke, consequences no longer moved slowly. They were immediate, brutal, surgical. Maybe the first sign would be small. You arrive at a dinner party and notice you've been moved to a different table, a corner table, next to someone who only speaks about their horse. Then invitations stop arriving. At first, you assume it's a mistake. Perhaps the mail got lost. Perhaps someone forgot. But then you open the society pages and see photos of last night's party, the one you used to be invited to, and you suddenly realize everyone was there but you. Then, your membership at one of the clubs quietly lapses. A polite letter arrives. We regret to inform you that your application for renewal has been postponed. Postponed never meant postponed. It meant you were being gently pushed out the back door. Losing access to the clubs wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. Those clubs were how business deals happened, how marriages were arranged, how alliances were forged. Being exiled meant losing not just social standing, but influence, income, and the fragile security that reputation provided. And then the worst blow of all, the way people looked at you changed. Social death was a slow fade. A woman's polite smile lingered a little too long. A gentleman avoided eye contact. Servants stopped using your full name. Your rivals became strangely sympathetic, and nothing was more suspicious than that. All of this could begin from nothing more than a rumor whispered in a velvet-lined opera box. That's the danger of a social ecosystem built entirely on perception. One wrong move, one unlucky moment, one jealous rival, one photograph taken at the wrong time, and your entire world could collapse faster than a soufflé at sea level. This was the true terror of the wealthy, not poverty, not illness, not failure. Social death. To be seen as scandalous, to be frozen out, to be forgotten. And yet, for all their fear, they played this dangerous game willingly. They whispered. They speculated. They spied. They bribed. They exposed. They buried secrets. They resurrected them, and they performed politeness like it was theatre. Because in this glittering, gilded world, everyone secretly believed the same thing. Better to ruin someone else's reputation than lose your own. And with that quiet truth sharper than any gossip column, we continued deeper into the underbelly of the Gilded Age, where luxury was dazzling. But survival was, well, complicated. Don't be like the Gilded Age elite who took without giving. Go on, tap subscribe. It costs nothing, and it made us know you played your part. If you thought wealthy New Yorkers were content with ballrooms, chandeliers, and the usual assortment of marble staircases, oh no, that was merely the appetizer. The true extravagance of a Gilded Age mansion revealed itself only once you wandered deeper inside into rooms so unnecessary, so theatrical, so beautifully impractical that even modern celebrities would look around and whisper, "This is a bit much." Let's start with one of the most impressive flexes of the era, the conservatory. Picture stepping from a cold, soot-smudged Manhattan winter straight into what felt like a tropical island. Wealthy families built entire glass-walled jungles attached to their mansions. Inside, orchids from Java, palms from India, giant ferns from Australia, plants that had never asked to live in New York, thrived under warm, humid air pumped in by a system more sophisticated than most hospitals had at the time. Servants misted the leaves each morning using brass sprayers, because apparently the plants needed spa treatments too. Guests walking through these conservatories pretended to be impressed by the foliage, but really, they were impressed by the heating bill. And then there were the Turkish smoking rooms, the peak of culturally confused luxury. These rooms were designed by wealthy Americans who had never been to Turkey, never met anyone from Turkey, and had only a vague sense that Turkish things look exotic and therefore expensive. Rooms covered floor to ceiling in patterned mosaics, velvet cushions stacked like architectural features, low tables with inlaid mother-of-pearl, and pipes displayed more for decoration than use. A wealthy gentleman might step inside, take a single self-important puff, cough violently, and declare himself a worldly man. These rooms weren't about smoking. They were about being seen smoking. But the real showstopper of the mansion was often the Gold Leaf Music Hall. Yes, a music hall in a private home. Some families had rooms large enough to fit a full orchestra and an audience. Imagine walking into a hall where every inch glowed. Gold-leafed ceilings, golden pillars, golden embellishments on every beam. If the owners could have gilded the air itself, they would have. Here, live musicians played for parties, recitals, rehearsals, or sometimes for absolutely no one at all, because what was the point of being rich if your walls didn't echo with music purely for the ambience? And just when you thought you'd seen everything, you would stumble into the private art gallery. This wasn't a modest walk-in room. It was a museum, a literal museum tucked inside a home. Portraits by European masters, marble busts of Roman emperors that had never been near Rome, enormous tapestries woven by artisans who probably never imagined their work would end up in a Manhattan drawing room. Some families displayed medieval swords, ancient coins, even human fossils, because nothing says, "I come from good stock," like having a dinosaur tooth under glass. Wealthy hosts would stroll around these galleries giving casual, inaccurate descriptions of their collections, while guests nodded politely, pretending to understand the difference between Renaissance and Baroque. Now, let's explore the architectural obsessions that made all this possible. We begin with imported marble from Carrara because, evidently, the marble found in America simply wasn't dramatic enough. Wealthy New Yorkers wanted the same marble Michelangelo carved, They wanted floors that gleamed like frozen lakes and staircases so smooth you could slip and sue someone, though it would be socially inappropriate to do so. Shipping tons of marble across the ocean was absurdly expensive. But that was the entire point. Then there were the hand-painted ceilings. Imagine hiring European artists to lie on scaffolding for weeks, painting cherubs, clouds, mythological battles, or allegorical scenes representing virtues the family absolutely did not possess. These ceilings were masterpieces, seen only by servants dusting for cobwebs. But to the wealthy, they were proof of refinement. Guests rarely looked up, but if they ever did, they were meant to feel dwarfed by culture. A psychological tactic, really. And yes, it gets even better. Some rooms had walls plated in gold and silver, not gold-colored paint, not metallic wallpaper, actual sheets of precious metal applied to wood panels. If you're wondering whether these rooms were comfortable, the answer is no. They were shimmering boxes of cold opulence. But comfort wasn't the goal, intimidation was. Guests were supposed to walk in and gasp, as if they'd just stepped into the treasury of a very stylish dragon. All these rooms, the conservatory, the Turkish parlour, the music hall, the art gallery, were architectural statements, but beneath their beauty lay something much quieter, much more revealing. These rooms weren't just decorative, they were distractions. The wealthy filled their homes with jungles, mosaics, gold, and art to avoid seeing what their lives actually were. Enormous, echoing, often lonely. Houses had so many rooms that family members could go days without seeing one another. A man could spend all morning in his smoking room, a woman in her private boudoir, the children in upstairs nurseries, the servants everywhere all at once. Everyone existed together, but separately, like planets orbiting the same star without ever touching. And woven through all that isolation was something else, competition, because each bizarre room had to outperform someone else's. If the Vanderbilts added a conservatory, the Astors added a larger one. If the Morgans installed a gallery, someone else installed two. If one home displayed gold-leaf ceilings, another gilded entire walls. It became a game of architectural one-upmanship, a deadly serious hobby where the prize was simply being talked about more than one's rivals. Guests didn't attend dinners to enjoy themselves, they attended to take inventory. Whispers spread like wildfire. Did you see their new winter garden? Her music hall is terribly outdated. They bought another mosaic? How desperate. Every new room was a flex. Every renovation was a declaration. Every absurd architectural feature was a way of saying, we are richer than you, and here's the evidence, in imported gold and tropical humidity. And yet, beneath all this noise, all this ornamentation and ambition, lay a strange quiet, a stillness you could feel inside these enormous rooms, a loneliness padded with velvet walls and warmed by imported marble, a sense that all this beauty, all this extravagance, was built not just to impress others, but to fill an emptiness no amount of gold could disguise. Because in the end, the rarest room in any Gilded Age mansion wasn't the conservatory, or the Turkish parlour, or the music hall. It was a simple one, a room where someone genuinely felt at home. If you've ever wondered how those enormous mansions ran the ones with gold-leaf ceilings, tropical conservatories, and music halls big enough to house a small army, here's the secret. They did house a small army. You just weren't supposed to see them, because for every wealthy family pacing their marble hallways upstairs, there were dozens of people downstairs, moving silently, tirelessly, and often heartbreakingly unseen. Let's start with the cast of characters, because the job titles alone could fill a small directory. At the top of this hierarchy stood the butler, the commander-in-chief of the domestic world. The butler knew every secret, managed every servant, and guarded the reputation of the household with the seriousness of a military officer protecting a royal crown. If the master of the house was the head, the butler was the spine and sometimes the brain. Then there was the housekeeper, the iron-willed general of the indoor world. She managed the maids, the linens, the cleaning schedules, the silver polishing, and the infinite list of tasks required to keep 50 or more rooms spotless. She knew exactly which guest was allergic to lavender, which one stole napkins, and which one flirted with the footmen. Below her were the chambermaids, who tackled the impossible, keeping every room immaculate. They made beds the size of small parade floats, dusted statues imported from Italian villas, and cleaned carpets that cost more than they made in a year. They moved so silently you'd think the house swept itself. Then came the valets and ladies' maids, personal attendants to the wealthy. They handled clothing, grooming, whispered crises, and the daily emotional meltdowns of people who didn't know how to locate their own cufflinks. These attendants knew their employers better than anyone else, sometimes better than the spouses did. They were the first to see the wrinkles, the grey hairs, the panic before a party, the arguments before a gala. Next were the footmen, who were basically walking decor. They wore uniforms so ornate they looked like furniture come to life, embroidered jackets, shining buttons, impeccable posture. Their tasks included opening doors gracefully, carrying trays elegantly, and standing still for unnatural amounts of time. A footman's true function was to make the household look wealthy and well-staffed, even when the family was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. And we can't forget the governesses, the underpaid and overworked educators who raised the children of the elite while parents attended parties or went about their busy schedule of existing. Governesses taught languages, history, manners, and piano. They comforted children who rarely saw their parents, and they maintained a level of grace so polished it could rival the marble floors. This was the role of the invisible army. Now, their daily rhythm, the heartbeat of the mansion, began long before the wealthy ever opened their eyes. Servants woke at 4 a.m., when the city was still wrapped in darkness. Before breakfast was even a thought, they were already scrubbing, polishing, heating water, lighting fires, and preparing the house for the day. By the time sunlight reached the upper floors, most servants had already worked for 4 or 5 hours. They moved through whisper-only hallways, designed to muffle sound. Servants weren't just expected to be quiet, they were expected to be nearly undetectable. A proper servant was like a shadow, present, essential, but never seen unless summoned. And then there were the secret passages, the mansion's hidden highways, entire networks of narrow hallways, hidden doors, back staircases, and clever architectural illusions allowed servants to slip between rooms without being noticed. A family member could ring a bell, and seconds later a servant would appear from nowhere, as if the house itself had manifested them. Servants used these passages to deliver food, to change linens, to light fireplaces, to clear dishes, to switch out clothing, all without ever intruding on the sight of the wealthy. If the lady of the house walked down a long, echoing hallway, she would never see the servants ducking out of view behind sliding panels or disappearing into narrow staircases. This invisible movement wasn't optional, it was demanded. The wealthy wanted their mansions to seem naturally perfect, as though marble polished itself and meals materialized from thin air. Servants existed to maintain the illusion that luxury required no labor, but beneath the silence, beneath the polished floors and carved woodwork, lay the emotional world of the people who kept these mansions alive. Servants had dreams, quiet ones. Some hoped to save enough money to move to better housing. Others dreamed of opening small shops, or reuniting with families still overseas. Some dreamed simply of a day off, which many didn't receive for weeks at a time. They also carried resentment, the kind that builds slowly when you iron someone's clothes while wearing the same 2 dresses year-round. When you polish silver, you'll never touch socially. When you watch parties from behind cracked doors, unseen, unheard, yet essential for every moment unfolding inside, there was gossip. Too, an entire culture of whispered commentary. Servants knew everything. Who was cheating, who was bankrupt, who had debts hidden behind their glittering facade, who was mean, who was kind, who cried before bed, and who had secrets stored in safes. If you wanted the real truth of high society, you didn't look to the newspapers. You listened to the servants, and despite all this, there were moments of quiet pride. A well-set table, a perfect dinner service, a ballroom prepared for hundreds. Servants formed bonds with one another, sharing humor, hardship, and survival within a world that was both suffocating and strangely communal. Because while the wealthy lived in the grand rooms upstairs, servants lived in the thin spaces in between the attics, the basements, the passages that stitched the mansion together like arteries. They were the quiet machinery beneath the glittering world of the elite. In many ways, the servants didn't just run the households, they held them up, silently, invisibly, and with more strength than anyone upstairs could imagine. If you've ever felt guilty for buying something slightly unnecessary, maybe a scented candle or a shirt you did not need, don't worry. The wealthy of early 1900s New York would have laughed kindly at your restraint before proceeding to spend more in an hour than most people made in several years. Because to be a true Gilded Age tycoon, shopping wasn't just a hobby. It was performance art. It was emotional therapy. It was warfare. Let's start with the most glorious arena of consumption, the private salon. If you walked into Bergdorf Goodman in the early 1900s, and I do mean walked, because you wouldn't dare arrive without a chauffeur, you wouldn't simply browse the racks like a civilian. No, you would be escorted straight past the public areas, through a velvet rope, and into a private room set aside for you and only you. Inside this salon, rows of mannequins might stand like a silent army, each dressed in outfits handpicked for your tastes, your social calendar, and most importantly, your budget, which was assumed to be bottomless. A team of attendants hovered nearby like decorative clouds. Some brought you tea or champagne. Some held accessories. Some were there simply to watch and make approving noises. Every outfit presentation was a ceremony. A model would glide in wearing a Paris gown that cost more than a townhouse. The attendants would circle around, adjusting hems and straightening beadwork while you, the wealthy shopper, sat serenely on a chaise longue, nodding as though all of this was perfectly normal. Because to the elite, it was. If you liked an outfit, someone took notes. If you loved an outfit, someone fainted. If you disliked an outfit, the salon director vowed never to show such a disgrace ever again. And money was never discussed. Ever. Purchases were charged directly to an account, and the bill would arrive at your husband's office weeks later, where it would be met with a sigh, a groan, or the quiet knowledge that it was too late to object. But clothing was only the warm-up. The real drama unfolded in the jewelry salons. Imagine stepping into a room lit not with bright bulbs but with soft, flattering candlelight, because diamonds, you see, look best when illuminated like a secret. A jeweler would present trays lined with velvet, each holding pieces worth small fortunes. Ropes of pearls the length of your arm, emeralds darker than forest shadows, sapphires the size of teaspoons, and diamonds that could blind you if you looked too closely. You didn't shop for jewelry, you auditioned it. Attendants held mirrors, jewelers made suggestions. This will catch the light beautifully at the opera. A rival might accidentally appear across the room, pretending to browse while spying on your choices. If you purchased a particularly valuable piece, it didn't leave the store with you. You received a polite nod, a handwritten receipt, and nothing else. The item itself would travel later by a special courier, sometimes an ex-policeman, sometimes an armored car, and would be placed into a secret household safe that only a handful of servants, and maybe your lawyer, knew existed. Wealthy families had entire protocols for storing jewelry. Some safes were hidden behind paintings, some inside closets, some behind false walls, and in the really grand households, an entire locked room served as the silver vault, where not just jewelry but priceless tableware, tapestries, and ceremonial objects lived in the dark, waiting for their moment on display. But here's where this chapter becomes truly fascinating, because the shopping wasn't actually about the things being purchased. It was about the feeling. Shopping, for the wealthy of New York's Gilded Age, was one of the few socially acceptable forms of emotional anesthesia. You couldn't talk about loneliness or anxiety that would be tacky, but you could spend the cost of a house on imported lace and call it preparing for the season. For many elite women, shopping was their only outlet. Their days were tightly controlled by social expectation. Luncheons, charity events, teas, fittings, more luncheons. Shopping was the one activity where they felt a sense of agency, even if that agency came in the form of declaring, "No, I don't like that sleeve." Shopping was also a cultural sport. Entire rivalries were waged through purchases. If your neighbor bought a new Russian sable coat, you bought a longer, fluffier, morally questionable one. If your friend acquired a diamond tiara, you acquired two, and then pretended not to care. Department stores became arenas where reputations rose and fell. One bold outfit choice could make you the talk of the next gala. One misstep could make you the subject of polite ridicule. And because everyone was watching everyone else, the pressure to consume, to buy, and then buy again became a kind of competitive oxygen the elite breathed. You didn't shop because you needed something. You shopped because someone else had shopped. This endless consumption shaped identities. People became known for their handbags, their gowns, their jewelry collections, their perfume preferences. Wealthy families maintained fashion archives, noting which gowns had been worn where, to avoid the unforgivable sin of repeating an outfit at a high-profile event. And beneath the glitter and spending lay something strangely tender and sad. The knowledge that none of these purchases filled the emptiness they were meant to soothe. No amount of lace or diamonds could fix a cold marriage, a lonely child, or the constant anxiety of maintaining social dominance. But the wealthy kept shopping anyway because in a world built on appearances, consumption wasn't just an activity. It was a language, a shield, a declaration. And so, with silk gowns rustling, diamonds sparkling under candlelight, and receipts piling up like winter snow, the Gilded Age tycoons of New York shopped themselves into legend and into bankruptcy, one elegant purchase at a time. If you ever feel fancy ordering takeout twice in one day, let me assure you, the wealthy of early 1900s New York operated on a completely different culinary planet. Food wasn't just nourishment for them, it was identity, status, theatre, and sometimes a not-so-subtle reminder to the rest of the city that their pockets were deeper than the Atlantic. Let's begin where all good dishes begin. The pantry. Except this wasn't your average pantry with flour, beans, and maybe a forgotten can of peaches. No, the pantries of the Gilded Age elite were closer to miniature warehouses stuffed with luxuries so extravagant they could have been mistaken for museum pieces. Imagine walking into a cool, dimly lit room and seeing mountains of oysters because New Yorkers were obsessed with oysters back then. They ate them with the enthusiasm modern people reserve for pizza. But the wealthy didn't just eat New York oysters. They demanded the rarest, most delicate varieties shipped in from other coastal states on refrigerated rail cars, packed in ice and straw like fragile jewels. In another corner, crates of peaches sat carefully cushioned, arriving fresh from orchards hundreds of miles away, even in winter. Fancy eating peaches in January? The Gilded Age elite did. They liked to demonstrate that seasons meant nothing to them. If nature said no, their money said, "We'll see about that." You'd also find veal shipped from the Midwest, chocolates from France, spices from the East, and vegetables grown in special heated greenhouses maintained solely so certain families could enjoy fresh asparagus whenever the mood struck. And that was just the pantry. Far more impressive and intimidating was the kitchen. Here lived the true emperors of the household world. The chefs. Not just any chefs. French chefs. The kind who wore tall hats that looked like architectural statements. The kind who scowled artistically. The kind who could whirl a copper pan like a magician casting spells. These chefs were treated like celebrities long before the Food Network existed. Families competed for the best ones, sometimes poaching them from rivals by offering higher salaries, nicer quarters, or promises of absolute creative freedom. If you could secure a chef who had apprenticed in Paris or trained in a Michelin-starred kitchen before Michelin stars were even a thing, inside these kitchens, noise and flavor exploded. Copper pots clanged. Flames erupted underneath skillets. Assistants chopped vegetables with the precision of surgeons. Servants darted around carrying trays of ingredients so fresh they still smelled like their original homeland. It was a world of sweat, speed, and artistry. And at the center of it all was the head chef, orchestrating chaos with the authority of a king conducting an opera. Every day, the wealthy received custom menus handwritten, of course detailing the dishes the chef had prepared for them. Breakfast might include delicacies like smoked trout or imported jams. Luncheon could feature consommé, delicate sandwiches, and buttery pastries. Dinner was a longer affair. Roast meats, seafood towers, elaborate soufflés, and desserts so beautiful they looked like they belonged in a jewelry box. And heaven forbid a guest disliked something. The chef would take it personally, the housekeeper would panic, and an emergency dish might be created on the spot, all to maintain the illusion that the family's taste and the chef's genius were perfectly aligned. But beyond the technical brilliance of the kitchen, beyond the piles of imported ingredients and the gleaming copper tools, lay something deeper. Food as statement. Because for the wealthy, what they ate wasn't just food, it was a message. A coded language of power. Take ice cream, for example. Today, you can eat ice cream anytime you want. Ice cream in the winter was a scandalous display of wealth. It required ice houses, ice delivery, storage rooms chilled by massive blocks, hauled in from upstate New York, or even as far as Maine. To serve ice cream in January was to essentially stand up and announce, "I have conquered both dessert and the weather." And it didn't stop there. Some families served flaming desserts, towering confections, soaked in alcohol, and set ablaze at the table, not because they tasted better on fire, but because guests would gasp, clap, and secretly wonder how much the spectacle cost. Others insisted on serving dishes containing ingredients so rare that only a handful of suppliers in the world carried them. Truffles from France, game birds from England, shellfish retrieved from icy northern waters. A well-connected chef could order things so exclusive that even other wealthy families couldn't get them. And then there were the dishes that existed solely to show off. Extravagant terrines molded into shapes of animals, pastries with gold leaf, pâtés that sparkled. Entire fish served with gemstone-like garnishes. People didn't eat these things for flavor. They ate them because someone else might be watching, and because the core rule of elite dining was simple. If something is expensive, difficult to obtain, or wildly impractical, serve it immediately. Food was the easiest way to perform wealth. Clothes could be copied, parties could be matched, jewelry could be rivaled. But food? Food changed daily. Food required constant spending. Food was an ongoing demonstration of relevance, a live performance that demanded chefs, servants, suppliers, and the steady beat of imported rail cars. Meals became silent competitions. A dinner invitation wasn't merely hospitality. It was an invitation to witness the family's ability to command resources, connections, and culinary brilliance. And yet, beneath all the pomp and caffeine-fueled artistry, the wealthy often felt strangely disconnected from what they ate. Meals were rushed through before events. Diet fads swept through the elite like storms. Social anxiety sometimes overshadowed appetite, but the spectacle remained. It had to. Because in the glittering world of New York's filthy rich, food wasn't just a pleasure, it was a performance. A performance that required oysters in winter, peaches on demand, chefs who yelled in French, and ice cream served long after the frost had settled outside. And the show never stopped. And while we're here, thousands of you listen nightly but still don't subscribe. Don't be like the Gilded Age elite. Go on. Tap. Subscribe. If you've ever looked at an old photograph of a Gilded Age child's stiff posture, solemn expression, absolutely drowning in lace, you might assume their life was sweet and pampered. And in some ways, it was. These children grew up surrounded by luxuries so excessive that modern toy companies would stare and whisper, "We could never afford that." But beneath all the silk and privilege lay something far quieter, far lonelier, and far more complicated. Let's begin with their physical world, the rooms where wealthy children spent almost all their time. Imagine a nursery not painted in cheerful colors with cartoon animals, but decorated like a miniature European palace. Elaborate rugs imported from Persia, furniture carved so intricately you'd wonder whether it was meant to be played with or worshipped. And then there were the toys. These weren't mass-produced plastic toys from a factory. No. Wealthy children received toys shipped from Paris, handcrafted by European artisans, dolls with real human hair, tin soldiers with hand-painted uniforms, miniature carriages pulled by mechanical horses, elaborate doll houses that were sometimes larger and definitely better decorated than the servants' living quarters. Some families bought entire toy rooms, not toy chests, not toy shelves, rooms dedicated solely to entertainment, rocking horses that could gallop across a track, puppet theatres with velvet curtains, and intricate train sets that circled miniature towns. Wealthy children never experienced boredom from lack of toys. Their boredom came from something else entirely. But before we get there, let's peek into their education, a world far more intense than any modern tutoring schedule. These children were trained like tiny diplomats preparing for a future summit. A proper Gilded Age child learned French almost as soon as they learned English. German was added soon after. If the family was particularly ambitious, an Italian tutor appeared on Thursdays. Music was non-negotiable. Piano lessons started early, often before breakfast. Not because the children loved music, not at all, but because every wealthy household needed at least one child who could impress dinner guests by playing something delicate and tragic on command. Then there was fencing, because nothing says refined upbringing like teaching a 10-year-old how to duel with a sword. This wasn't about defense. It was about posture, discipline, and the ability to look elegant while holding a blade. And of course, deportment lessons, the art of standing, sitting, walking, bowing, smiling, existing. How to descend a staircase, how to turn their head at the correct angle, how to greet strangers, and even how to hide boredom without looking dead inside. An entire education dedicated to performance. A typical day for a wealthy child was more structured than a corporate training program. Rise early, greet the governess, language lesson, music lesson, a carefully supervised walk in the garden, lunch in the nursery, never with parents, penmanship exercises, history lessons, deportment drills, playtime. That wasn't really play, but an extension of learning. More music, more reading, then bed. It sounds impressive on paper, a schedule designed to shape model citizens. But here's where the story turns, because beneath all the luxury, beneath the gowns and toys and tutors, was the most striking fact of all. Wealthy children rarely saw their parents. Their mothers were busy hosting luncheons, teas, and charity events. Their fathers were busy running businesses, attending clubs, or shaking hands with people who pretended to be their friends. Children existed in the periphery, loved in theory, but managed in practice. Parents made appearances like visiting royalty. They'd stop by for a pat on the head, a compliment about posture, or a reminder about behaving properly at an upcoming event. Some children could go days without speaking to either parent. This created a strange mixture of privilege and loneliness. They lived in beautiful rooms, but were often emotionally starved. They ate the finest food, but had little freedom. They played with exquisite toys, but longed for companionship. Their caregivers loved them, but the hierarchy ensured that affection always had a polite boundary. And then, hovering over everything, was the pressure, the unspoken demand that these children become perfect heirs. A wealthy child wasn't raised to discover themselves. They were raised to continue the family's legacy. Every lesson, every tutor, every carefully supervised moment was designed to shape them into a certain kind of adult, poised, respectable, impressive, marriageable, capable of navigating a world where reputation mattered more than happiness. If you were the eldest son, the pressure was enormous. You were groomed to inherit the estate, to oversee the business, to carry the family name. Every mistake felt catastrophic. Every moment of rebellion threatened the image your family spent decades constructing. If you were a daughter, the expectations were different but equally heavy. Your education wasn't about running a business, it was about becoming the perfect ornament to a future husband of the correct social rank. Your value lay in your charm, your refinement, your accomplishments, your potential fertility, and your ability to sit still gracefully during long dinners without fainting. This created a form of emotional weight that no ornate nursery or Parisian toy could counteract. And yet, in the quiet moments, you'd find pockets of real humanity. Children laughing with their governess, sneaking cookies from the kitchen, running through the halls when no adults were watching, whispering secrets to siblings, dreaming of futures that didn't involve arranged marriages or inherited titles. Some wealthy children were kind, some were lonely. Some, shaped by privilege and pressure, grew cold and distant. And some grew up determined to escape the world their parents built, to find meaning outside the gilded cage. Because in the end, the private world of wealthy children was a paradox, filled with everything money could buy, yet missing many of the things that matter most. Their childhoods glittered, but glitter, as we know, doesn't warm a room. If you ever find yourself imagining that wealthy New Yorkers of the early 1900s, married for romance, locking eyes across a ballroom, hearts fluttering, violins playing Let Me Gently, lovingly shatter that illusion. In the upper crust of Gilded Age New York, marriage was never simply about love. It was an economic strategy, a political alliance, a merger disguised as a wedding. Love wasn't forbidden. Of course, it just wasn't required, expected, or even particularly relevant. Let's start with courtship, a process so structured it made international diplomacy look casual. We begin with the almighty calling card, the social currency of the day. If you wanted to signal interest in someone, you didn't text them or send a DM. You left a card, a small, elegant rectangle embossed with your name at their home. You did not hand it to them directly. That was far too personal. No. You presented it to a servant, who placed it on a silver tray, who then delivered it to the person you hoped would consider your existence worth acknowledging. If they liked you, they returned the gesture and sent their own card. If they did not like you, your calling card mysteriously vanished, swallowed into the void of polite rejection. Once you passed the calling card test, you could move into the next stage, chaperoned interactions. Young couples did not go for walks alone. They did not sit together alone. They did not breathe the same air alone. A chaperone, often an older female relative or a family friend with excellent posture, accompanied them at all times. She acted as a human moral force field, ensuring no wandering hands, no stolen kisses, and no improvised decisions ruined a family dynasty. Conversations were polite and scripted. How do you find the weather? What are your thoughts on the opera? No, truly, how do you find the weather? Meanwhile, both families observed closely, judging everything from posture to grooming to the potential spouse's ability to make small talk without fainting. But beneath all this civility lurked the real machinery of courtship business. Because in the world of the filthy rich, marriages were less about compatibility and more about consolidation. Wealthy families married to strengthen networks, merge fortunes, expand influence, and fortify social standing. Two powerful families combining assets was practically an economic event, one that newspapers tracked with glee, detailing every diamond, every guest, every cake layer, as if reporting on stock market movements. These alliances weren't carefully hidden. Everyone knew. Parents sat down with their lawyers and financial advisors and discussed marriage the same way one might discuss a corporate acquisition. They have old money. They have new money. They have a title. They have a shipping empire. These assets complement each other beautifully. And sometimes, the deals became international. Enter the era of transatlantic marriages, when wealthy American families married their daughters to bankrupt European aristocrats. This was, in essence, a trade agreement. The American bride brought her father's vast fortune, and the European groom brought a title, an estate, and a family crest so old it practically smelled of medieval dust. Dozens of American heiresses became duchesses, countesses, and baronesses this way. Meanwhile, European nobles breathed sighs of relief as the infusion of American cash saved their collapsing estates. Everyone won, except, perhaps, the couple actually getting married, who often met only days before the engagement was publicly announced. But what about the private lives behind these strategic unions? Well, now we step into territory that's both fascinating and quietly tragic. Because while the weddings were enormous spectacles, dresses sewn with pearls, guest lists longer than novellas, cakes taller than small children, the marriages themselves were often far less glamorous. Many couples lived in separate bedrooms, even in separate wings of their homes. This wasn't necessarily due to dislike, it was simply the norm among the elite. Personal space was seen as a luxury, and intimacy was something handled with more scheduling than spontaneity. Wives were expected to maintain elegant homes, host flawless dinner parties, support charitable causes, and produce heirs. Their days were filled with fittings, luncheons, teas, and 1,000 invisible rules about etiquette, posture, and social responsibility. Husbands were expected to run businesses, manage estates, attend club meetings, and maintain the family's public reputation. Their days were filled with deals, cigars, and the occasional 2-hour meeting at the club that absolutely no one asked questions about. And because these marriages were rarely based on closeness or shared interests, loneliness crept in, quietly wrapped in silk and surrounded by luxury. Affairs became surprisingly common: a lonely husband, a neglected wife, a handsome riding instructor, a charming opera singer, an attractive neighbor with a conveniently absent spouse. These things happened often enough that servants gossiped in whispers, letters were burned, and private investigators suddenly found themselves employed for suspiciously long hours. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of these marriages wasn't the infidelity or the absence of love, it was the pressure. The pressure to maintain appearances, to pretend that everything was perfect, to uphold a public image that required constant performance. Imagine waking up each day knowing your marriage was being judged by newspapers, peers, servants, and strangers. That every gesture at a party, every smile at a luncheon, every appearance at the opera was being scrutinized. That a single crack in the facade could spark rumors that traveled faster than the wind. Some couples grew close in spite of this companionship forged through shared duty. Others drifted apart completely, connected only by mutual obligations and the ghost of family expectation. Either way, the truth was simple. Marriage in the world of the Gilded Age elite was not a love story. It was a carefully negotiated contract, a business merger sealed with vows, a ceremony built on strategy, not spark. And yet, within all this strategy, there were moments, small, tender moments where real affection slipped through. A shared joke, a genuine smile, a quiet evening without guests. But these were rare flickers, not the foundation. For most wealthy couples of 1900s New York, marriage was a role they played impeccably, publicly, and endlessly. If you've ever wondered where the real decisions of early 1900s New York were made, let me tell you, it wasn't in the boardrooms. It wasn't in the mansions. It wasn't even in those glittering, chandelier-heavy ballrooms that hosted parties with lions and champagne fountains. No, the true centers of power were tucked behind heavy oak doors, past marble columns, beneath ceilings decorated with paintings of stern-looking ancestors. They were the private clubs, the quiet, exclusive sanctuaries where the wealthy gathered to smoke. Let's start with the men's clubs, because they were the loudest about their importance. The Union League Club, for example, was a fortress, a grand institution decorated with oil portraits of men who looked like they'd been born frowning. Past its doors, you would find plush leather chairs, billiard tables, roaring fireplaces, and the kind of silence that wasn't quiet so much as loaded. Every conversation felt like it came with a warning label: power negotiations happening. Membership was invitation only, and even then, you needed the right connections, the right background, and preferably a family tree with fewer scandals than the average household cat. Inside, the city's business elite debated policy, plotted investments, and gossiped about rivals. If someone wanted to know what the stock market might do next week, they didn't consult an analyst. They watched who entered the club, who left early, and who suddenly looked nervous near the whiskey decanter. Then there was the Knickerbocker Club, the holy temple of old money. It was so exclusive that even being wealthy didn't guarantee you entry. You needed pedigree ancestors who arrived on the Mayflower, or at least before the Civil War. The Knickerbocker was less about loud deals and more about quiet superiority. Its members didn't need to brag. Their existence did it for them. Here, men read newspapers with an intensity suggesting they might actually bite the pages. They played card games that seemed relaxed but were absolutely not. A single eyebrow raise could end a business alliance. A poorly played hand could hint at deeper troubles. A subtle whisper behind a cigar could shift the future of entire companies. But don't be fooled, these clubs weren't all solemn nods and whispered conspiracies. They were social laboratories where loyalties were tested, friendships formed, betrayals brewed, and alliances, once forged, tended to last a lifetime. Now, while the men were busy pretending to manage the world over brandy and billiards, the women's clubs were quietly, almost invisibly, running enormous parts of society. Take the Colony Club, New York's first private women's club. Founded partly because wealthy women were tired of waiting for men to finish their cigars, the club swiftly evolved into a powerhouse of influence. Behind its elegant facade, Women organized charity events that funded hospitals, schools, and orphanages. These weren't small bake sale operations. These were full-scale fundraising campaigns that could alter the city's future. But don't let the word philanthropy fool you into imagining quiet ladies sipping tea and knitting blankets. These women were strategists. They used charity as leverage. An influential woman could raise an eyebrow at a luncheon and decide the fate of a social debutante. She could direct thousands of dollars in donations to a cause she believed in, or quietly withhold support from someone who had offended her. Every event was a chessboard. Every decision carried weight. Women formed secret alliances. A conversation during a needlework session might look innocent, but hidden within it were negotiations, plans, and political maneuvering. They coordinated campaigns to protect neighborhoods, support cultural institutions, and navigate scandals. They managed social calendars that controlled who, saw whom, when, and under what circumstances. And unlike the men, who sometimes stumbled home from their clubs smelling like they'd bathed in scotch, these women ran their clubs with the precision of diplomats. They maintained networks so powerful that even the men's clubs occasionally took signals from them quietly. Of course, because heaven forbid they admit it. But the real magic of these clubs, men's and women's alike, happened behind closed doors, in the spaces the public never saw. This was where the real conversations unfolded. A billionaire railroad tycoon might sit next to a steel magnate, and without a single word spoken directly about business, make a deal that shifted the nation's economy. An alliance might form over a shared complaint about city taxes. A merger might be hinted at during a game of chess. And sometimes, though no one admitted it, public enemies became private collaborators, bound together by mutual benefit. And of course, there were betrayals. Silent ones, smooth ones, the elegant, polite kind that left no fingerprints. A man might raise his glass in a toast to a colleague and then quietly undermine his business the next morning. A woman might praise a rival's charity work at a luncheon and then ensure the next event was scheduled the same night, guaranteeing a social split. Clubs were places where friendships were tested not by conflict, but by proximity. Then there were the lifelong pacts. These were formed through shared history. Men who had attended the same university, women whose families had summered together for decades, people who found themselves on the same committees, charities, boards, or scandal cover-ups. These relationships lasted years, even decades. They outlived fortunes. They survived social collapses. If someone belonged to your club, they belonged to your world. If someone didn't, well, you didn't talk about them. Private clubs held immense social power. The wealthy didn't simply join them, they relied on them. These spaces provided sanctuary from the public eye, protection from rumors, and access to information unavailable anywhere else. Inside these walls, reputations were repaired, alliances were forged, and the foundations of New York's elite society were quietly, consistently rebuilt. Outside those walls, the world kept spinning loud, chaotic, unpredictable. Inside, everything felt controlled, managed, inevitable, because in the Gilded Age, you were only as powerful as the clubs that would let you through the door. If you think wealthy New Yorkers simply lounged around their mansions until boredom set in, oh no. For the elite of the early 1900s, leisure was a full-time job, with a calendar more carefully managed than a monarch's. These people didn't just take vacations, they migrated, like very well-dressed birds, traveling from mansion to mansion in a seasonal loop so predictable you could map their movements like animal tracking charts. Let's begin with seasonal migration, the great social exodus of the wealthy. As soon as summer hinted it might arrive sometimes as early as May, wealthy families began packing. Not suitcases, not weekend bags. Entire wardrobes, steamer trunks the size of small closets were filled with gowns, tennis outfits, parasols, furs, hats, and more hats, because wealthy women believed strongly in two things: never repeating an outfit, and never trusting a single hat to cover all occasions. Servants packed the trunks, labeled everything, and shipped it out days or even weeks before the family left. The servants, the real heroes of this operation, traveled ahead to prepare the summer mansion. Floors had to be polished, bedrooms aired out, crystal washed, gardens revived, kitchens stocked, and heaven forbid a wealthy family arrived to find dust, or a wilted flower, or an incorrectly placed chaise longue. Disasters like those could end careers. The wealthy, meanwhile, departed at their leisure, stepping onto private railcars like royalty, embarking on a diplomatic tour. Their destinations varied, but all were extravagant. Newport, Rhode Island, with its ocean views and competitive mansion building. The Adirondacks, where rustic luxury cabins cost more than factories. Or grand European tours, where families pretended to absorb culture while secretly judging how European elites dressed, dined, and behaved. But let's pause in Newport, the crown jewel of wealthy summer escapes. Life here revolved around the cottages, and yes, they actually called them cottages, even though some had 60 bedrooms, Italian gardens, and rooms plated in gold. These seasonal mansions weren't homes, they were performance pieces. Families tried to outdo one another with ballroom sizes, imported marble, and fountains that sprayed water higher than their neighbors. It was an architectural arms race disguised as vacation. Once settled in, it was time for leisure activities, which were somehow both relaxing and exhausting. There was tennis, the sport of choice for young elites trying to look athletic without sweating too much. Matches were played in immaculate white outfits that seemed specifically designed to show how rarely their owners touched dirt. Then came croquet, a game so deceptively calm that only wealthy people could turn it into a battlefield of passive-aggressive competitiveness. If you think aristocratic women couldn't be vicious, you have never seen one gracefully send an opponent's ball into a bush with a smile that said, "This is what happens when you wear last season's lace." And, of course, grand picnics, which were picnics only in the sense that they technically occurred outdoors. In reality, they were catered affairs with tables, china, crystal glasses, servants delivering fresh courses, and enough food to fuel a small town. Families lounged in the shade or tried to while musicians played nearby. You didn't sit on the grass during these picnics. The grass was decorative. If Newport was their summer kingdom, the Adirondacks were their attempt at roughing it. Although their definition of roughing it included cabins with electricity, chauffeurs, and fireplaces lit by staff, wealthy families tried to embrace nature canoeing, hiking, breathing fresh mountain air, while their servants discreetly followed with blankets, water, and silver thermoses filled with hot chocolate. Then, when winter rolled around, the wealthy escaped the frost by heading south to Palm Beach or onward to Europe for extended tours. A short winter trip could last 3 months. A longer one? The entire season. European tours were grand adventures. They visited Paris for gowns, Vienna for music, Switzerland for fresh air, and London for gossip. Wealthy mothers hauled their daughters around Europe like show horses, hoping to secure advantageous marriages or at least return home with stories impressive enough to dominate the social season. But beneath all these glamorous escapes was something less shiny, something rarely spoken of openly: boredom. The wealthy were constantly, profoundly bored. Imagine endless days of leisure without purpose. No meaningful work, no genuine independence, no spontaneity, everything scheduled, every outing observed, every moment curated. Even the fun felt like obligation. A croquet match wasn't a game, it was social performance. A picnic wasn't a meal, it was a statement. A European tour wasn't exploration, it was a cultural arms race. Leisure became another arena of competition. Families compared how long they spent abroad, how large their summer guest lists were, how elaborate their Newport cottages looked this year. Even vacations were graded, and so they ran from Newport to Europe, from Europe to Palm Beach, from Palm Beach to the Adirondacks, trying to outrun the invisible, persistent feeling of emptiness. They weren't just escaping the heat or the cold, they were escaping their rivals and themselves. This constant movement created a strange emotional landscape. Moments of genuine joy appeared: laughter on a boat ride, a sunset watched from a veranda, a quiet morning on the shore, but they were always overshadowed by expectations. A wealthy child might build sandcastles, but only with the governess present. A couple might stroll on the beach, but only after a social luncheon. A family might enjoy a vacation, but only if they managed to outshine all the other families taking vacations. And yet, In those rare, unguarded moments late at night, walking along a quiet path or sitting by the ocean, some of the wealthy realized something their money couldn't fix. They weren't relaxing. They were performing relaxation. Always watched, always judged, always compared. Their leisure was as exhausting as their social seasons, because in the Gilded Age world of New York's filthy rich, even vacations weren't escapes. They were stages just decorated with sea breezes and mountain air. And since you're still here, don't be shy. Tap subscribe. If you thought the wealthy of early 1900s, New York simply lounged around looking effortlessly flawless, let me assure you, the effortless part was an illusion. Behind every smooth cheek, every glowing complexion, every serene smile at a charity luncheon, there was work. Tremendous, exhausting, sometimes questionable work. In an era long before Botox and filters, the elite relied on a dizzying mix of private physicians, beauty rituals, tonics, gadgets, and the occasional medically sanctioned nonsense to maintain their image. Youth wasn't just admired, it was expected, a moral duty, almost, and the wealthy spent fortunes trying to preserve it. Let's begin with the quiet power players of this world. The private physicians. These were not your ordinary doctors. These were medical magicians, hired exclusively by the elite doctors who made house calls to mansions, carried leather cases filled with mysterious bottles, and charged fees so high they could have retired after treating a single headache. They had one main job: keep the wealthy functioning well enough to host parties, attend clubs, and pretend nothing was ever wrong. Their toolkit was extensive. First came the famous nerve tonics. These magical liquids promised to cure everything from insomnia and fatigue to low spirits and general delicateness. What they actually contained, depending on the brand, was a surprise assortment of alcohol, caffeine, cocaine, opium, or all three. A wealthy woman might take a sip of her nerve tonic before an afternoon tea, feel wonderfully serene, and have absolutely no idea why. Physicians also administered stimulant injections, often containing early versions of amphetamines, to perk up hosts who needed to power through an evening engagement. Feeling tired before a gala? Don't cancel, call the doctor. He'll fix you right up. And then, of course, there were early cosmetic treatments, though they didn't call them that. They were restoratives, youth renewers, or complexion enhancers. Some involved electric currents passed lightly over the skin. Others involved mildly painful scrubs advertised as circulation boosters. A few brave souls even experimented with early chemical peels, which provided a glow at the cost of temporary redness, and a sensation undoubtedly described at the time as zingy. But physicians were only half the story. True dedication to beauty happened at home, or rather, in the mansion's private dressing rooms, where the wealthy perfected their beauty rituals with religious devotion. Take the cold cream regimen, for example. Cold cream was the superstar of Gilded Age skincare. Women slathered it on thickly at night, creating a white, ghostly mask that promised to soften wrinkles and nourish the skin. Servants sometimes referred to these nightly looks as the haunting, because if you accidentally encountered the lady of the house mid-cream, you might lose a year of your life in shock. Then came the electric beauty devices, glorious little gadgets that buzzed, whirred, or hummed with purpose. Electric brushes claimed to stimulate hair growth. Electric rollers claimed to tighten the skin. Electric masks, yes. Masks promised to awaken the complexion through gentle pulses. The wealthy trusted electricity like a modern person trusts Wi-Fi. Vaguely, blindly, and with absolutely no understanding of how it worked. And let's not forget the skin tonics, each one marketed with the confidence of a potion master. These bottles contained mixtures of rosewater, glycerin, witch hazel, citrus oils, alcohol, and occasionally ingredients no one could pronounce. They promised radiance. They promised youth. They promised vitality. Most importantly, they promised results before next Thursday's luncheon. But here's the twist. Beneath all the creams, all the treatments, all the electric wizardry, something deeper was happening. Something quieter. Something more human. Many wealthy New Yorkers of this era were mentally exhausted. But because discussing mental health was considered shocking, almost impolite symptoms were disguised as nervousness, delicacy, This was the era when the wealthy whispered things like, "Oh, she's not ill. She's just fatigued. He isn't depressed. He's simply overworked. She needs rest, not medicine." Except they did need medicine, or therapy, or time, or boundaries, and strict instructions to think pleasant thoughts. When a wealthy person reached their breaking point, when the pressure of parties, perfection, social competition, marriages, and gossip became too much, they quietly disappeared to one of the era's famed sanatoriums. These were private retreats, often in the countryside, where the wealthy went to recover from life while pretending they were simply taking a holiday. The sanatoriums provided rest cures, weeks of silence, warm baths, gentle walks, and meals served in serene dining halls. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Some found clarity there, others found boredom. Many found that they missed their nerve tonics. But the truth is this: behind the glowing complexions and perfect curls, the elite were often tired, deeply tired, exhausted from performing wealth, performing beauty, performing stability. Their lives demanded constant upkeep, not just of their homes, but of themselves. They were terrified of aging, terrified of losing relevance, terrified that a wrinkle or a hint of fatigue might be interpreted as weakness by people secretly waiting for them to falter. So they slathered the creams, they drank the tonics, they submitted to electric gadgets, they booked the retreats, they smiled, and they pretended, because in the glittering world of New York's filthy rich, youth wasn't simply admired, it was armor, a shield against judgment, a symbol of vitality, an unspoken requirement in a society obsessed with appearances. And beneath all those layers of cold cream and rosewater, the truth lingered quietly. They weren't trying to stay young, they were trying to stay worthy. For all their elegance, for all their polished silver and imported marble, the wealthy of early 1900s New York carried a secret. Behind every dignified smile, behind every charity luncheon and opera box seat, there existed an underworld of indulgence that most outsiders never saw. A world where boredom, pressure, loneliness, and sheer excess pushed even the most respectable families into habits they would never dare discuss in public. Let's start with the spaces they built for these hidden desires, the hidden rooms. Imagine walking through a pristine mansion, all velvet drapes and glittering chandeliers, only to find a door disguised as a bookshelf. Behind it, a private room filled with thick, sweet-smelling smoke curling upward from long pipes, an opium den, hidden deep inside a Fifth Avenue home. Some were styled with Eastern decor. Low couches, patterned pillows, dim lamps with colored glass. The wealthy didn't use these rooms constantly, but they existed as quiet retreats, sanctuaries where the pressures of perfection could dissolve in a haze. Then came the era of prohibition, which only made things more interesting. When alcohol became illegal in 1920, regular people scrambled to find speakeasies. The wealthy? They simply upgraded their basements, secret compartments opened to reveal wine cellars larger than some restaurants. Mahogany bars appeared behind sliding panels. Liquor was smuggled in from Canada by private couriers, wrapped in crates labeled kitchen supplies. Wealthy hosts would smile sweetly at their guests and say things like, "Shall we step into the reading room?" which was never used for reading, unless you count reading the labels on contraband whiskey bottles. And yet, these hidden rooms were only the beginning, because once night fell and reputations could hide behind shadows, the elite slipped into secret clubs, places even more exclusive, more thrilling, and more dangerous than the private clubs we discussed earlier. Start with the underground gambling salons. Not chaotic, smoky dens filled with shouting men, but refined, velvet-lined rooms hidden beneath townhouses or behind fake storefronts. Wealthy New Yorkers gathered around felt-covered tables, placing bets large enough to buy an entire block of tenements. Roulette wheels spun, cards snapped. Whispered wagers moved like electricity through the room. Some nights, fortunes changed hands in a single hour. These gambling salons were more than games. They were adrenaline, a way for wealthy men and women to feel something, anything in lives where everything else was scripted and predictable. Winning felt intoxicating. Losing felt equally intoxicating, because even loss proved that consequences existed outside of social reputation. Then there were the illicit jazz rooms, hidden in basements, attics, and secret back rooms of hotels. These were not polite soirees with string quartets. These were vibrant, pulsing worlds filled with saxophones, smoke, laughter, and music so alive it made the chandeliers upstairs shake. The wealthy who ventured into these spaces weren't looking for social approval, they were looking for escape. And yes, these clubs often featured private dancers, performers, whose presence was never acknowledged in polite conversation. Men attended under the pretense of business. Women attended under the pretense of curiosity. Everyone knew the truth, and everyone pretended not to. But beneath the thrill of these secret clubs, beneath the smoke, the music, the risk, the dancers lurked something darker, something more personal. Because for many wealthy New Yorkers, these hidden worlds weren't just entertainment. They were a symptom, a pressure valve, a way to cope with a life that was gilded on the outside and cracking on the inside. This brings us to the final layer of this chapter: personal collapse. For some, the vices were small, a little too much champagne, a little too often, a few late nights at the gambling table, a discreet visit to an underground jazz club to forget the suffocating etiquette of their normal world. But for others, the cracks widened. A wealthy socialite might become dependent on the nerve tonics. Her private physician prescribed tonics spiked with cocaine or opium, taken not for pleasure, but for numbness. A businessman under immense pressure might drink himself into oblivion in his hidden bar, surrounded by bottles he kept secret even from his own family. A lonely heiress might find herself returning to the jazz rooms night after night, seeking human connection in places where no one asked her to smile politely or host a luncheon. And the saddest part? No one outside their household ever knew, because the wealthy were experts at maintaining illusions. Servants cleaned up after late-night binges. Friends smoothed over embarrassing incidents with carefully worded explanations. Society columnists conveniently omitted scandals involving families who paid their bills on time. Everything was polished, concealed, corrected, until, occasionally, it wasn't. Some collapsed publicly at parties, too exhausted to maintain the facade. Others disappeared quietly to sanatoriums under the guise of rest. Some gambled away shocking amounts of money. Some ruined marriages. Some ruined themselves. But just as often, these collapses went unnoticed, swallowed by the silence that surrounded wealth. When a person's entire life is performance, their pain becomes part of the script neatly hidden behind a fan, a smile, a perfectly tailored suit. That was the true underbelly of the Gilded Age elite. Not the opium dens, not the hidden bars, not the gambling salons or secret jazz rooms. It was the quiet desperation that drove people into those spaces in the first place. The desire to feel free for a moment, the desire to escape expectations, the desire to forget, even briefly, the pressure of being perfect. Behind the gold, behind the glamour, behind the glittering facade of early 1900s New York. For all its shimmering beauty, its gold-plated ceilings, its orchestras and parties and marble staircases, the world of early 1900s New York's elite carried within it a slow, steady rot. Not a sudden collapse that came later, in 1929, but a quieter, unraveling, years in the making, a kind of decay that began not in bank accounts, but in drawing rooms, dinner tables, and the anxious hearts beating under velvet gowns and tailored suits. Let's begin with the first layer of this decline: internal decay. Because while the mansions sparkled, the finances behind them were often held together with metaphorical chewing gum and wishful thinking. The wealthy competed so fiercely that they sometimes spent themselves into oblivion. One family built a ballroom, so another built a bigger one. One hosted $1 million party, so another hosted a $2 million party. This wasn't just competition, it was financial warfare, and everyone wanted to win, even if winning meant quietly drowning in debt. Some families owned 3 or 4 mansions, one in Manhattan, one in Newport, one in the Adirondacks, and one built purely to annoy a relative. Each mansion required dozens of servants and constant upkeep. The bills were astronomical. Imagine paying for hundreds of employees, endless renovations, imported ingredients, European trips, wardrobes for every season. All of it for the sake of status. Even the richest families struggled to keep up. Some mortgaged their estates. Some relied on risky investments. Some gambled entire fortunes at clubs and salons. Overspending wasn't a flaw, it was the culture. If you weren't drowning in debt, were you even trying? But the rot went beyond finances. It seeped into the architecture of society itself. While old elite families were busy competing with one another, something far more disruptive was happening outside their gilded walls. New wealth was rising. The Gilded Age had been built on old money fortunes inherited from ancestors who made their riches in shipping, real estate, banking, or railroads. These old money families believed deeply in their own superiority. They had rules. They had traditions. They had exclusive clubs that acted as fortresses against anyone whose family tree wasn't at least a century deep. But by the early 1900s, new money had arrived with the confidence of a guest who doesn't realize they aren't invited. Industrialists, tycoons, innovators, entrepreneurs, people who got rich fast, shockingly fast, building industries that didn't exist 50 years earlier. Oil, steel, electricity, automobiles, banking empires, department store chains, consumer goods. New wealth grew like wildfire, unpredictable and unstoppable. And these new money families didn't care about the old rules. They wore bold fashions. They bought enormous homes. They hosted spectacular parties. They flaunted wealth instead of whispering it. They joined or built their own clubs when the old ones wouldn't let them in. Old money watched in horror as their exclusivity eroded. Their codes of etiquette, once sacred, began to crumble under the weight of a generation that valued glamour over subtlety. When the Vanderbilts, who had been considered vulgar, newcomers decades earlier, finally forced their way into elite society, it became clear the old guard couldn't hold the gates forever, and the world outside was changing too. Women demanded independence. Workers demanded fair wages. Immigrants brought new cultures. Cities expanded. Electricity, automobiles, telephones, all shifted the social landscape. The elite had built their world on the assumption that nothing would ever change, that their families would always sit at the top, untouched by the chaos below. But change didn't knock. It walked straight in. Yet the deepest decline wasn't financial or social. It was emotional, because for all the beauty of their world, the glittering parties, the opulent homes, the flawless table settings, there was a hollowness at the center, a kind of quiet ache. Many wealthy families lived in enormous mansions full of people, yet felt profoundly alone. Conversations were scripted. Marriages were strategic. Friendships were transactional. Everything was performance. Everything was about appearances. Children were raised by governesses. Wives hosted endless events they didn't enjoy. Husbands worked themselves into breakdowns trying to maintain unsustainable lifestyles. Everyone smiled. Everyone sparkled. Everyone struggled in silence. And underneath it all, there was fear. Fear of scandal. Fear of failure. Fear of aging. Fear of irrelevance. Fear that their world, the world they built, wasn't as solid as it looked. Because it wasn't. Little by little, the cracks widened. The stress of competition chipped away at their sanity. The demands of society wore down their marriages. The pressure to maintain perfection hollowed them out. They lived inside mansions but felt trapped inside cages, gilded cages, yes, but cages nonetheless. And so, even before the stock market crash of 1929 came crashing down, even before fortunes evaporated, many of these families were already falling apart internally. Their wealth had protected them from many things, but it couldn't protect them from themselves. The decline of their world wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow unraveling, a quiet slipping away of meaning, a recognition, whispered in dark bedrooms and lonely hallways, that all the extravagance, all the parties, all the performances hadn't filled the emptiness they had tried so hard to ignore. In the end, the most striking truth of early 1900s, New York's elite wasn't how dazzling their world was, it was how fragile it had always been, a glittering shell with a hollow center. A kingdom built on marble steps and shifting sand, and perhaps, deep down, they knew it. Close your eyes for a moment and let the noise of 1900s Manhattan fade into the distance. The carriages, the orchestras, the clinking glasses, the whispers of gossip behind feathered fans, let all of it drift away like smoke rising from a ballroom at the end of a long night. You've wandered through their mansions, peeked behind their velvet curtains, strolled their private clubs, and witnessed the golden spectacle that dazzled the world. And now, gently, we step back out of it, as if slipping out the side door of a party that went on a little too long. The Gilded Age was beautiful, yes, glittering, immense, intoxicating, but it was also fragile, full of pressure and longing, full of people who lived in palaces, yet struggled to find peace inside their own minds. Wealth gave them shine, but not certainty, comfort, but not ease, beauty, but not meaning. As you lie there now, settling deeper into your pillow, let that sink in softly. Even the people who had everything were often searching for something more, something quieter, something real. Maybe that's why these stories feel strangely comforting. They remind us that humanity doesn't disappear behind wealth or titles or marble staircases. Everyone, in every era, is doing their best to navigate their own life, even if their house has 126 rooms and a fountain shaped like a Greek god. So breathe in and breathe out, letting the glitter fade, letting the music drift, letting the city grow dim and distant. You've walked through the gilded world. Now it's time to rest in yours. Sleep well, or stay awake if you must, but let your mind settle like snow falling softly over an old, quiet avenue. And before you drift off completely, a gentle reminder, you made it all the way to the end. You're one of the rare listeners who actually stays for the whole journey. If you haven't subscribed yet, go on. Be supportive of this work, this channel, and these long, cozy stories you return to night after night. Good night, friend.